So who needs God? Some of us think everybody does. Some of us think nobody does. Some of us used to, but we'd say, I don't need him anymore. Some of us wish we didn't need him, but we can't get away from the idea that we do. Some of us say we need God, but we don't really live like it. I mean, it is such a great question. It's such a powerful question, and it's a question, isn't this true? It evokes a lot of emotion, doesn't it? It creates a lot of passion around it. You take a question like, who needs God? And you drop it into the middle of a conversation with some people at school, at work, friends, whoever, and well, you'll see some passion start to come out, won't you? Because everybody has an opinion on it. I'll tell you what else everybody has an opinion on. As a matter of fact, people are way more passionate about this question than even who needs God. It's the question, who needs religion? Now, you drop that question into something and then back away from the table because everybody wants to talk about that. Some of you, when I bring this question up, you say, okay, I'm kind of okay with the idea of God, or if you want to believe in God, that's okay. That doesn't fire you up. But we start talking about religion, and you're real quick to say, I don't need that. I have been there. I have done that. I bought the T-shirt. I gave it back. It was not very good. I don't want anything to do with it because from your point of view, religion is toxic. It is just toxic. And so you don't want anything to do with it. And I've got some good news for you. You are not alone. You're not. There is a growing number of people in our country who would agree with you totally. Don't miss this. There's a growing number of people in our country who believe that not that religion is a solution to the problems of the world. That's what people used to believe. Religion is a solution to the world's problems. Now there's a growing number of people who believe the exact opposite. They believe religion is the primary cause of the world's problems. And maybe that's you. Now this line of thinking really started gaining some steam, and this movement kind of began to pick up some momentum right after September 11, 2001. You guys remember what happened that day. After the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon were attacked, the first Sunday after that, now you probably didn't pay much attention to this because you don't live in my world, but the first Sunday after 9/11, guess what happened in all the churches around the country? They were packed. I mean packed out. Second Sunday after 9/11, they were still pretty packed. Third Sunday after 9/11, everything went back to normal. And I've got a theory as to why that is, but I'm not going to jump into it today. But I'll tell you what happened. What happened as a result of that is there began a movement, or a movement began to gain some steam that day that I would call an anti-religion movement. Up until that point, people who had nothing to, wanted nothing to do with religion or saw nothing good in religion would say, you know what, I think it's good for some people. Like, religion's kind of a neutral thing. If it's your deal, and that's fine. But after 9/11, a movement began to gain some steam that was of the opinion religion is not neutral, religion is not helpful, and religion is not good for anybody. And so we think the world would be a better place without religion because we're convinced religion is the cause of all of the world's problems. Now, this gained steam through the leadership of a few guys. One of them was named Sam Harris. You may or may not be familiar with him. Sam Harris is an atheist, but he is also a brilliant neuroscientist. I probably didn't have to put the word brilliant in front of that. If he's a neuroscientist, he's brilliant, right? He is a really, really smart guy. I listened to his podcast. I've read his books. Sam Harris, right after 9/11, he began to write a book, and the book was called The End of Faith. Now, the subtitle I loved. The subtitle was Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason. And in this book, Harris makes a really articulate case for why religion, all religions, it wasn't just an attack on Islam, this was an attack on Christianity, all religions. Christianity was really front and center in many ways. But Harris makes an argument for why religion is at the center and is the source of all the problems that we have in our world today, and why we should not tolerate religion any longer, why we should try to eradicate religion entirely, and why we should embrace atheism instead. But what was interesting when he wrote this book was that it didn't get published until 2004, because after 9/11, publishers were like, who's going to buy an anti-God book? So over a dozen publishers turned him down. He finally got it published, and guess what happened? It stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for 33 weeks once it was published in 2004. It sold a lot of copies. And it caught the attention of a lot of Christians. And so guess what Christians did? You're not going to find this surprising. Christians, most of whom probably never even opened the book and read it, they just read the cover and didn't like it. So Christians began emailing or writing Sam Harris and telling him all the reasons why he was wrong and how he was going to destroy the world because he was attacking Christianity. And so Harris, being the brilliant guy he is, 2 years later decided, fine, I'll just write a little book to address all these Christians who keep emailing me obnoxious emails. And so he wrote a second book in 2006 called Letter to a Christian Nation. This is a little book. It is a fascinating, fascinating book. And basically what Sam Harris does in Letter to a Christian Nation, is he explains precisely why, from his point of view, Christianity and Christians are at the root of all the problems in our country and at the root of all the problems in the world. Now, about the same time in 2006, there was another atheist who wrote a book and came along on the publishing scene. Another brilliant guy, he's an evolutionary biologist named Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is a professor at Oxford University. You may have heard of him. And Dawkins wrote his famous book that's called The God Delusion. The God Delusion. Now, when I read this was another fascinating one. Some of you are going, wait a minute, you read all these atheists? Yes, I do. That's really comforting to you Christians, isn't it? I've read all of these books I'm talking about. I just found them fascinating. So anyway, he writes The God Delusion, and Dawkins does something very similar to what Harris does, just in a little bit of from a different angle. Dawkins makes a case for why all religion, and Christianity in particular, is bad, why it's contributing to the problems, or is the source of the world's problems. And then Dawkins makes a case for why atheism is logical, rational, and should be embraced by everyone. Now, what I loved about Dawkins' book from the very beginning, I opened it up and I started reading the introduction. And in the introduction, Dawkins, he doesn't mince any words. He doesn't try to fool anybody. He lays out exactly his intent for writing the book. Listen to what he says. Here's what he wrote. If this book works as I intend, religious readers who open it will be atheists when they put it down. That's about as clear as you can get, isn't it? Some of you are sitting there wondering, did it work on Matt? Why are we talking about this? Stay tuned. By the end of the series, you'll know the answer to that. But he was so direct about this, I loved it. This is my goal. Because again, he's of the mindset, just like Sam Harris. Religion can no longer be looked at as something that's neutral or something that, okay, we'll just tolerate it. It brings some good to society. No, they become convinced it brings no good, only harm to society, and they need to turn all religious readers or all religious people into atheists if they possibly can. Now, right after that, the next year after God Delusion came out, so 33 million copies. Can you imagine that? Right after that, another man by the name of Christopher Hitchens, who was an atheist, but he's a journalist, and unfortunately he's passed away. But Hitchens wrote a book that you may have heard of. It, in some ways, became the most famous of all of them. And he didn't leave any doubt about what his agenda was. He just put it right on the cover. Hitchens' book was called God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Wonder what that's about. We know where he's going, right? God is not great, how religion poisons everything. And what was so interesting to me about Hitchens' book when I read it was he didn't even try really, and he might disagree with me. This is just my perspective. From my point of view, he didn't even really try to build a rational case or argument for atheism. He just let out all of his frustrations and ranted about religion and Christianity for about 300 pages. It was a long, long, long rant. But he is convinced, as many of these others are, that religion actually poisons everything. Now, what happened was these three guys, along with a fourth by the name of Daniel Dennett, these four guys became known as the New Atheist. And I don't know if you remember this, you probably don't, but from 2006 on, these guys became really popular, very, very popular. Their books were selling like crazy. They were on TV. They were making TV appearances all the time. They basically were doing tours around the U.S. They were stopping at a lot of college campuses and giving lectures and doing Q&As and teaching on what they had written about. They're all over YouTube. If you're interested in them, you can go find and watch some of their presentations on YouTube. You can see some of the debates that some of them have done with Christians or with other religious people. But here's what was so interesting about it. With all their popularity and with all the books that they sold and with all the talk around this, guess what happened to the number of atheists in America? Nothing. Atheism did not grow. The number of people who identify as atheists didn't tick up at all. However, here's what did happen. While it appears that they did not convince people to be atheists, what they did convince them of is that religion is a problem. And so the number of people who identify as religious went down dramatically. And the number of people who said, okay, I'm not identifying with any religion anymore, including atheism, began to increase rapidly. Matter of fact, that group of people, and some of you, you're in this group. Some of you can relate to this. This is you. I'm going to be telling your story today. For some of you, or for some of them, that group of people began to grow at such an exponential rate that it caught the attention of researchers who study demographics and do all this kind of thing. And researchers actually gave a name to this movement, and they gave a name to this group. And here's what they called it. They called it the rise of the nuns. The rise of the nuns. If you're listening to this on a podcast, that's not N-U-N-S. That's a whole different movement, okay? The rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. The nuns. In other words, the rise of the group of people who are non-affiliated with any religion whatsoever. This group began to grow at a rapid pace. Now, this is some of you, okay? Some of you would say, I'm not an atheist, but I'm also not for religion. I don't want anything to do with religion, and you've separated yourself from that, or you've walked away from that. I get that. And this, you may find this term none offensive. I just want to say this is not my term, okay? If it's offensive, I'm sorry. Researchers labeled you that. I did not do it. But this is what they call it. This is what they call it. And this is, as I said, the fastest growing group of people in our country. The latest research shows this, that 23% of all Americans, so basically 1 out of every 4 Americans, and 35% of millennials, that's over 1 out of 3 of all of you millennials. 23% of all Americans, 35% of all millennials, no longer affiliate themselves with any religion. In other words, they say, I am a nun, I am non-affiliated, I have walked away from religion, I haven't embraced atheism, but I've walked away from religion, and I'm just going to live right here in the middle. Now, I'll give you a quick characterization of what researchers say nuns are typically like. Now, you know this is stereotypical, and this is a broad brush, and this doesn't apply to all of you or to all the people who fall into this category. But generally, what researchers tell us is that there are more males than females who fall into the category of a nun. They tend to be left-leaning politically. And when it comes to theology, they tend to be agnostic or apathetic, which just means this. A nun is not the person that when you say, if you're a Christian, when you say, I'm a Christian or I go to a church, they immediately go on a big rant about how evil or bad church and Christians are, okay? That is probably not a nun. Most nuns are more like this, and this is some of your stories. Most nuns would say, hey, if you go to church, okay, that's your deal. You can do what you want to do. If you believe in God, that's your deal. But I have been there, I have walked away from it, and I don't want anything to do with it again. It's not that I'm angry at everybody. It's just not helpful. It is not appealing to me anymore. So, that's what a nun looks like, okay? Now, for some of you, this is really helpful because for some of you, this is how you have felt. This is your story. But you didn't know how to describe it, and you've tried to describe it to your mama who keeps telling you to go to church, and she doesn't understand why you don't want to go to church anymore, and she doesn't really get it. Well, now you know, like this is your category. These are your people. So after service today, you can call her and give her some great news. You can say, Mom, I was in church today, and she'll be so thrilled. And then you can say, not only that, but I figured out what I was. I'm a nun. I'm a nun. Just spell it out, or she's going to get super confused, okay? Just N-O-N-E-S. I'm that kind of a nun, right? But you can explain to her now, hey, there's a whole group of us. Matter of fact, there's a lot of us. There's nearly more of us than there is of you now, Mom, I think. So you can let her know that because this is the fastest growing group of people in America, people who have walked away from faith, who have walked away from religion, who've walked away from church, who have walked away from God. Now, here's what I want to do. Here's what I want to do over the next few weeks. First of all, I want to give you my perspective on this, and then I want to have a really honest conversation. Let's start with my perspective. See, you might assume that somebody like me would look at somebody like you who's walked away from God or walked away from church and say, that was a terrible decision, you shouldn't have done that, and you ought to come back immediately. But that is not my perspective. I hear a lot of what I call deconversion stories, a lot of stories of people who've walked away from Christianity. And I'll just admit, there are some exceptions, but in most cases, nuns. They have walked away, the religion they've walked away from is Christianity. I hear a lot of these stories. And in most every case, when I hear the story, I think to myself, and a lot of times I'll just tell them, if I had been you, and if I saw things the way you saw them, and if I had been taught what you'd been taught, and if I had been told what you had been told, I would have walked away too. I would have. Because what I usually see is that people who walk away from Christianity walk away because of a bad version of Christianity or a bad view of God that they have been presented. A bad version of Christianity or a bad view of God. But it was the version or it was the view that somebody like me, probably with a microphone in a church, standing up on a stage, they probably had a suit behind a pulpit, but you get the point. Like somebody like me communicated that bad version or that bad view to you, and you walked away, and it actually might have been a really, really healthy thing that you walked away from that. So I just want to give you my perspective of that on the front end, and then we'll move into what we're going to talk about today. My perspective, if you're somebody who's walked away from faith or Christianity, my perspective is this. It's simply this idea that they're going to put it up here in a second, that there it is, if you left Christianity or the church because it was not appealing to you, that's not your fault, that's our fault. If you left Christianity or the church because you decided that is not appealing, that is not your fault. You walked away from a version of Christianity or view of God that was presented to you by people like me. It's our fault that you walked away from that. It's our fault that you didn't find it appealing. Now, the reason I believe it's our fault is because of something we talk about around here all the time. We just talked about the last couple of weeks. It's because when you look in the first century at how people interacted with Jesus, at how people engaged with Jesus, and at how people viewed Jesus, you find something very, very different. In the first century, you find that people who were nothing like Jesus liked him, and he liked them back. People who were nothing like Jesus liked him, and he liked them back. They did not find him unappealing. They found him very appealing. They did not find him resistible. They found him very, very irresistible. And so if you find the church or Christianity or God unappealing and resistible, I'm guessing it's because we have done something to make it look, or to make him look, that way. Now, that being said, here's what I want to do for the next few weeks. I want to talk directly to those of you who fall into that category of a none. You walked away from faith, from church, from Christianity, from God. If you're a Christian or you're an atheist, if you're on either end of that spectrum, you're going to find a lot of helpful things in this. But I want to address specifically all of you nones because I want to have a really open, honest, transparent conversation about your frustrations, your skepticism, your doubts, your questions about the reasons in all probability that you chose to walk away. I think that is a discussion that is worth having, and so we're going to have it for the next few weeks. And one of my goals is this. As best I can, I want to voice for you a lot of those frustrations and a lot of that skepticism and a lot of those doubts, and then I just want us to talk about it, okay? Now, today, we're going to start here. I had to have a starting point somewhere. So I want to start with an idea that's going to be the foundation for everything we talk about the next few weeks. It sounds simple, but it's actually a really big idea. Our starting point is going to be this, that you cannot move away from something without moving towards something else. You cannot move away from something without moving towards something else, which means if you have chosen to move away from or walk away from God or from Christianity, it means by default you are moving towards something else. And it is important for you to understand what that something else is. If you're walking away from God or Christianity, let me tell you there's only one option. Let me tell you what it is that you are by default walking towards. You are walking towards atheism. That's what you're walking towards. Now, you're going, whoa, I'm not an atheist. I'm not saying you're an atheist, okay? I'm not saying you're an atheist. I'm just saying if you walk away from God, you walk towards atheism. If you walk away from atheism, you walk towards God. It doesn't mean you embrace the other, but you are moving in that direction. Now, some of you, a lot of you would say, because this is a none, this is where you live, you would say, no, I'm not going to embrace that. I don't find that appealing, but I don't find this appealing, so I'm just stuck right here in the middle. It's part of the frustration you have, right? You're just stuck in the middle. And from your point of view, from your perspective, you have chosen just to remain, to live, to stay right here in the middle. And I get that and I understand that. But I want to just toss something out there for you to think about. We're going to talk more about this later, okay? So if you'll probably disagree with me, that's okay. We'll discuss it more later. But I would make a case, I would suggest, that it is intellectually indefensible and intellectually dishonest for you just to stay stuck in the middle. As a matter of fact, I would make a case that's impossible. You can't just get in the middle and stay stuck and never move again. You're always moving one direction or another. You're always moving that way, or you're always moving this way. Now, this is not the preacher trying to make a case to get you to move back here. Because when you read Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, guess what all four of these new atheists say? They make the argument that this is not a defensible or intellectually honest position to stay in. That you may be in the middle, but you should always be exploring and moving towards one or the other. And ultimately embracing one or the other because there's too much evidence out there, there's too much information, and there's too much rationale for you just to continue to live in this, oh, I don't know, and I'm never going to know, and I don't want to find out. That you should be, even if you're here, you should be exploring. You should be figuring it out. And ultimately, they argue, and I would argue too, we agree on this, that you should end up at one end of this or the other. But I know you feel stuck here. You feel stuck here. And what we're going to do over the next few weeks is we're going to address the things that drove you here and the frustrations and tensions you have in being here and why it is so unappealing for you to walk back this direction. I'm going to be as honest as I can based on all the conversations I've had with my friends and everything I've read about people who are here. I want to do everything I can to be honest about the reasons it's so difficult for you to turn around and walk back. And we're going to talk through all of those. But today I want to do something just a little bit different to set the stage. Today I actually want to talk about what it's like to be on this end of the spectrum. If you are walking away from God, even if you don't embrace it, you are walking towards atheism, and you need to understand what it is that you're walking towards. You need to understand the direction in which you're going and what that means. Now, let me just, so I clarify, so there's no confusion, let me explain something before we get into this. This is not a series for atheists. This is not a series where I'm trying to convince atheists to believe in God. If you're an atheist, track along. Hopefully you'll learn some stuff, but that's not what this is. This is also not going to be a series about atheism. We're going to talk about atheism today, and then from there we're going to move and talk about all of us who are stuck in the middle, okay? But I got to start by talking about this because if you move away from one thing, you move towards something else. Now, here's what's so interesting. Atheism, this is what I want you to understand if you don't get anything else today. Like Christianity, atheism is a complex belief system that leads to some unsettling conclusions. I'm going to say that again. Just like Christianity, atheism is a complex belief system that leads to some unsettling conclusions. Atheism is way more than just, well, I don't believe there's a God. Nope. It's actually a very complex belief system, and just like Christianity, it leads to some very unsettling conclusions. That does not mean, and this is not my argument, I'm not arguing that because it leads to unsettling conclusions, it can't be true. Because unsettling does not equal untrue. Unsettling is never a truth test. Now, I'm going to prove this to you real quickly, particularly to those of you who either currently have a teenage daughter or at one point, you've got older daughters, but at one point you lived through their teenage years, okay? I'm going to prove this to you really easily. For all of you who have or have had a teenage daughter, think about this. The first boyfriend they ever had was both unsettling and unfortunately true. Isn't that right? Yeah, all of us who don't have teenage daughters chuckle. The rest of you who had one moan because you remember it's like, oh yeah, that sucker knocked on the door and he was such a, didn't deserve my daughter. It's kind of like, it was so unsettling to send her off on that first date, but it was a reality and it was true and you couldn't get around it. So unsettling does not equal untrue. That's true for Christianity. That's also true for atheism, okay? It's true for Christianity. It's also true for atheism. So here's all I want to do for the next few minutes. I want to explain to you the 6 tenets of atheism. The 6 tenets of atheism. I didn't make these up on my own. This is easy to explain because these new atheists, Harris, Dawkins, Hitchens, these guys, they have articulated the 6 tenets of atheism very, very clearly in all of their books. So I want to explain it to you. This is not an argument. Listen, this is not an argument against atheism. This is not an argument for God. I'm not trying to do that today. I just want you to understand, if you walk away from God, what it is that you are walking towards. Okay, you with me? So, the first 3 of these are probably going to be new information for most of you. The next 3 you're going to be pretty familiar with. So let's jump in. I'll do my best to to explain this. This is a little heady, but you're a really smart crowd, so you'll be fine with this. Here's the first one. It's what I call the illusion of mind. The illusion of mind. Now, Harris and some of these guys sometimes refer to it as the illusion of self. Let me explain it this way. If there is no God, everybody imagine with me for a minute that's true. If there is no God, then you are nothing more, and I am nothing more, than biology, chemistry, and physics. If there is no God, that's all we are. We are nothing more than biology, chemistry, and physics, which just means this. It means that you have no mind. You have a physical brain, but your mind is intangible. You don't have a mind. You just have a physical brain. You have no self. There is no you in the sense that you think about you. There's none of that. I know it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. But if there's no God, then the only thing that exists about you is the physical, tangible, I can see it, touch it, feel it part of you, which means you don't have a body, you are a body. This is what Christopher Hitchens talks about. He wrote a book. Unfortunately, Hitchens died of cancer, I believe it was. And he wrote a book as he was going through all of this, detailing it, and he talks about how his doctor kept looking at him as he was talking about the cancer and saying, well, the cancer's doing this to your body, and your body's doing this because of the cancer, and your body's doing this because of the cancer. And finally, Hitchens stopped him and said, Doc, no, you're wrong. I don't have a body. I am a body. Because if there is no God, then all that exists of you is biology, chemistry, and physics. Okay? Now, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. It's kind of hard to live that way. As I was reading these guys and reading through these books, I thought, what would it be like to live a day where I actually believed this, where I just believed everybody I encountered, there was nothing more to them than just their physical body. That was all there was of them. And when it was gone, they were gone. That my wife is just a body, my kids are just a body, you're all just a body, my coworkers are just a body. I mean, I didn't make it very far, because we just don't think this way, do we? You just can't hardly figure out how to live that way. But just because it's unsettling, again, doesn't mean it's untrue. But this is a natural conclusion of atheism. That if there is no God, you're just biology, chemistry, and physics, which means you have no mind, you have no self, you have no soul, there is no you apart from your body. You're just a physical body. Now that leads to the second tenet of atheism, which is this. It's the illusion of free will. So if there is no God, you're only biology, chemistry, and physics, which means everything that you do has been pre-programmed, predetermined by your biology. In other words, you do not have freedom to choose because you don't have a mind apart from your physical brain. So everything that you choose to do, like you think you're choosing to do it, but you're not actually choosing to do it because everything you do has just been, your biology is programmed to do that. It's just like an animal. It's just like anything else. Your biology is programmed to do whatever the things are that you do. So you thought if you're married that you chose who you're going to marry. Nope, you didn't choose. Your biology had already decided. You thought you decided what you were going to eat this morning. Nope, your biology just told you what to eat. You thought you decided to come to church today. Nope, your biology told you to come to church today. You didn't really have a choice in it, which stinks for you because if there is no God and your biology is telling you to come to church, you're wasting time, but you can't stop from wasting time because your biology keeps telling you to come to church. You got some bad biology. I'm sorry about that. I don't know how to fix that. But that's where this leads, okay? That's where this leads. Now, what new atheists call this is a term for this. They call it determinism. Determinism. That you're pre-programmed, that you're pre-designed with your biology just to do certain things and not do other things. It's called determinism. Now, you've heard of Stephen Hawking, probably. Stephen Hawking's another brilliant guy. I mean, he talks about stuff us mere mortals cannot understand. Hawking is out there with some of the stuff he talks about. Well, Hawkins did a lecture on this idea of determinism. My understanding, best I could tell from reading it, Hawkins believes in determinism, and he did a lecture on it that was encaptured and put in one of his books, okay? And I wanted to read you part of what he said about determinism. He kind of jokes about it, but it is so true. Here's what Hawking wrote. He said, I've noticed that even people who claim that everything is predestined and that we can do nothing to change it look before they cross the road. Isn't that true? It's so true. But they can't help it because their biology tells them to look before they cross the road, so they do. But if they're going to get hit, they're going to get hit. I mean, it's just, again, this is a very difficult way to live, isn't it? I would say it's impossible to live this way because If you believe that everything is predetermined and that you have no choice in what you do, let me tell you where that's going to land you, where that you're going to end up. Eventually, your biology is going to do something that leads a lot of other biologies to lock you up for a really long time. That's what's going to happen. I mean, this is like impossible to live this way. It's a very unsettling conclusion. But again, I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying it's unsettling. Now, these two, the illusion of mind, illusion of free will, lead to the third tenet of atheism. It's this one right here. The illusion of value. The illusion of value. Now, as human beings, we embrace value. And what I mean by that is, we practically make every choice we make based on our set of values. We value people, we value ideas, we value exercise, we value education, we value work, we value all kinds of things, and we decide what to do based on what is most valuable or most important to us. However, if you are nothing more, and I am nothing more than biology, chemistry, and physics, okay, track with me. If we're nothing more than biology, chemistry, and physics, and we have no mind, and we have no choice, then there is actually no such thing as actual value. Nobody has actual value, because the things that you value, you only value because your biology is pre-programmed and pre-packaged to value those things. But the things I value, my biology is pre-programmed and pre-packaged to value, and you don't get to choose what you value, and I don't get to choose what I value. It's just what our biology tells us to value, which means there's no such thing as actual value. It means there's no objective standard of value that's true for all people in all places and all times. The only thing that can exist is ascribed value. I'm going to give value to that because my biology tells me to. You may give value to something totally different because your biology tells you to. But I can't look at you and say you value the wrong things. You can't look at me and say I value the wrong things, because it's pre-programmed into our biology. Now, let me tell you why this is such a big deal. I'm going to talk about it for about 60 seconds. You're going to go, whoa, 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 we got to talk about that more. And we're going to, okay? Week 5, I'm going to spend a whole Sunday talking about this idea, but I just want to introduce it right now. This is why, if there is no God, there can be no justice. Now, we all love justice. We all love justice to be done, especially when something's been done to us, right? We're all for justice in that case. But if there is no God, and we are only biology, chemistry, and physics, then there's no such thing as actual value, which means there cannot exist such a thing as justice. Because you can't look at me and say what I did was unjust. I just acted and operated based off of the ascribed values my biology is pre-programmed to give me. So what's just for me is not just for you, which means there is no justice. Everyone gets to do what is right by their own biology. Okay, so those are the first three. They may be new for you. But if you believe there is no God, and again, I'm not making these arguments up. Harris, Hawkins, Hitchens, these guys tell us this is where you go. This is where it leads. These are the natural conclusions to believing there is no God. Now, I'll give you the next three, and they're a little more familiar, okay? The fourth one is this, that something came from no thing. Harris and Dawkins, all these guys talk about this. Something came from no thing. You're probably familiar with this. That in other words, before the Big Bang, there was nothing. Well, you can't even say before because that connotates time, and there was no time. Like, it's hard to wrap your mind around, isn't it? Try to think about this. But before anything existed, there was nothing upon nothing upon nothing. And then suddenly out of nothing, nothing, nothing came something. Specifically, from no thing whatsoever came time, space, and matter. Lifeless time, lifeless space, and lifeless matter. There was nothing, and then all of a sudden, poof, there was something. Okay? Now, this is a natural conclusion. If you remove God from the equation, then this is what you naturally are led to believe. There's no other rationale. Something came from no thing. Now, atheists are honest enough, these guys are honest enough to acknowledge they don't have a really good theory or explanation yet for how that happened, but they believe they're going to find one eventually. As a matter of fact, Richard Dawkins, in a lecture, I believe it was a debate actually that he was doing, he made this comment around this idea. He said, in a sense, you can say cosmology is how the universe began. In a sense, you can say cosmology is waiting on its Darwin. In other words, we atheists, we haven't figured out yet a plausible explanation for how something just poof came from no thing, but we think eventually we're going to figure it out scientifically. We're waiting on somebody to come along and explain how things came into existence. But there was nothing, and then suddenly there was lifeless time, space, and matter. Okay, the next one is this. You'll be familiar with this too. The fifth tenet is that first life emerged from no life. First life emerged from no life. So there was nothing, and then suddenly there was something, lifeless time, space, and matter. And then from that lifeless time, space, and matter, at some point came first life. There was no life at all, and then suddenly there was a first life. Now, atheists will sometimes make the argument, maybe you feel this way, atheists will sometimes make the argument that, well, the first life was so simple that we can kind of see how it might have taken a leap. But scientists have disproven that today. All scientists are now in agreement, all credible scientists are in agreement, that the simplest life forms on the planet are still very, very complex. As a matter of fact, Dr. Francis Collins, I don't know if you're familiar with him. Francis Collins, interestingly enough, is a scientist who's a Christian who was the head of the Human Genome Project, where they mapped out the entire human DNA. Can you imagine? He was head of that project when they completed that, and then he went on to be the director of the National Institutes of Health. How's that for having a couple weighty things on your resume? Like, he's way smarter than any of us. He describes it this way. I thought this was a great way to describe it. He said, if you believe first life emerged from no life, then what you believe is a transition happened from lifeless matter to the digital elegance of DNA. What a great way to put that. You believe something went from lifeless matter to the digital elegance of DNA with no help whatsoever. Again, I'm not making an argument of whether that's true or not true. It's just a conclusion that you must arrive at if you remove God from the equation, if you believe there is no God. And then this last one you'll be most familiar with. It's the idea that natural selection is responsible for all life. Natural selection is responsible for all life. In other words, that there was this unguided, purposeless, invisible force that took first life and explains how first life got to this life that we currently have. An unguided, purposeless, invisible force that managed to take first life and evolve it over time to this life that we currently have. Now, in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, I got to the end of it. It's in the very last chapter. I got to the end of it. And Dawkins is making a case for why natural selection is so true and so fascinating. And atheists aren't the only ones who believe this. There are Christians who believe in this too. But Dawkins is making a case for why natural selection is responsible for all life. And I got to this paragraph. Remember, I'm not a scientist, okay? I'm not a biologist. I got a business degree, not a degree in biology. So I'm just reading this from my own, through my own lens or my own perspective. So I get to this section. It's kind of a lengthy section. I'm going to read it to you in a minute, because when I got to it, he started describing how natural selection worked. And I thought at first, it just made me chuckle. I thought at first he was just kind of being funny about it. And then I realized, no, he's actually trying to bring a sense of awe and majesty and glory around this idea of natural selection. So I just thought I would read it, and I understand what he was trying to do. He's trying to help all of us to see, well, we should just stand in awe that natural selection is responsible for all life and that we're all here. So here's what he wrote. Hang with me. It's a little long, but you'll understand. Here's what he wrote. He said, think about it. On one planet, and only one planet in the entire universe. There are a lot of planets in the entire universe. On one planet, and only one planet in the entire universe, molecules that would normally make nothing more complicated than a chunk of rock gather themselves together into chunks of rock-sized matter of such staggering complexity that they are capable of running, jumping, swimming, flying, seeing, hearing, capturing, and eating other such animated chunks of complexity. Now, I was kind of chuckling here. He's talking about animals, but the way he's talking about it, if you're a scientist, you're going, well, yeah, of course. But I'm like, okay, molecules that should have made nothing more than a rock suddenly morphed into something that actually had life, and now those chunks of rock-sized matter of complexity are eating and one another, and they're seeing and they're hearing. I was just kind of chuckling. Then he went on to describe to us, he said this, capable in some cases of thinking and feeling and falling in love with yet other chunks of complex matter. Now, gentlemen, I'm just going to offer a suggestion. Next time you're with your lady, do not look at her and say, baby, I love you more than any other rock-sized chunk of complex matter I've ever seen. Don't go there. This might be scientifically true. I'm just saying don't use that terminology. We don't talk like this, do we? And for good reason. But Dawkins says, okay, I want you to understand. Whoa, this is what happened. Natural selection is so powerful. It's so, this unguided, purposeless, invisible force. Look what it did, and look where we ended up. And then he ends with this statement. He says, we now understand essentially how the trick is done, but only since 1859, referring to Darwin. He said, we couldn't figure it out, and then Darwin came along, and he filled the gap, and he explained it all for us. So, those are the 6 tenets of atheism. Again, it is not an argument for God. I'm not trying to make an argument against atheism. These are just the conclusions that you come to if you believe there is no God. These are the unsettling conclusions you arrive at least some of them are unsettling, if you believe God does not exist. Now, I'm guessing most of us, not all of us, some of you are atheists, and I respect that, but I'm guessing most of us don't believe that, and most of us hope most of these conclusions are not true. Because we hope our kids have value. We hope our friends have value. We hope we have freedom of choice. We hope our spouse has value. We hope there is more to us than just a physical body. We hope we have a mind and free will. We hope that all of this isn't true. But I will say the only hope for that is God. There is no other way you can avoid these conclusions. Now again, that's not an argument to embrace God. That's not my argument for why you ought to walk back towards God. Let me explain to you why I wanted to go over that, why I wanted to make sure you were aware of that. Because again, when you move away from something, you always move towards something else. And this is what you are moving toward if you have walked away from God and faith. You may not embrace it, but you are moving in that direction. And here's my hunch about you. Maybe I'm wrong, but here's my hunch about you. You did not walk away from Christianity and you did not walk away from God because one day you picked up Sam Harris's book or Dawkins' book or Hitchens' book or Dennett's book and you read it and you said, I've always believed deeply in God, but this makes so much rational sense. I'm just throwing my beliefs away. And right there on the spot, you threw them away and you walked away from Christianity. That's not your story. Your story is a little different. You walked away from Christianity because of some experiences you had with Christianity. Or you walked away from Christianity because somebody like me stood up in your church and they presented to you a really bad version of Christianity and a really bad view of God, and you eventually decided, if that's what God is like, I don't want anything to do with Him, and if that's what people who follow God are like, I don't want anything to do with them, and you walked away. Or you walked away because you approached somebody like me with some fact-based questions, and all you got were faith-based answers. In other words, you said, hey, I know Christians believe, and you've always taught, but let me ask you, because scientists say, and in college my professor said, or whatever, and you started asking some really, really great questions that deserved some facts, and all you got instead from somebody like me was, you should never doubt your faith. You should never doubt your faith. The Bible says, you need more faith. That's your problem. And you walked away shaking your head going, I don't think any of this makes sense if they can't even answer these questions, if they're not even open to discussing them. I'm fed up with it. I'm going to walk away. Or you walked away because when you were a child, you were presented with a childhood version of God and a childhood version of faith. And nothing wrong with that. That was appropriate at the time. The problem was, when you got to be an adult, you were never introduced to a deeper, more comprehensive adult view of God and adult version of faith. And so when the rigors and the pressures and the life experiences of adulthood hit you, your childhood view of God and your childhood version of faith couldn't hold up underneath them. And you decided, well, maybe this must not be true. This certainly isn't helpful. And you walked away. Now, here's what I would suggest to you. that the view of God or the version of Christianity you walked away from, that might have been a great call for you to walk away. But you might have walked away from a version of Christianity or a view of God that was wrong. You might have walked away from a view of God, from a God who doesn't even exist. And instead of turning around and walking back that direction and trying to explore who God is and what He's really like, you have assumed it's not your fault. This is, people like me presented this to you, but you have assumed you know all there is to know about God and you understand who He is, and you don't want to go back to that version, and you shouldn't. But you are missing the fact that God is different, maybe, from the God you walked away from. And maybe it's worth you turning around to explore that. But if you don't, you have to realize you're walking towards the other side. You're walking towards these 6 tenets of atheism. And as I said before, you cannot stay stuck in the middle. You can't just stay there forever because there's too much evidence. There's too much rationale. You owe it to yourself to dig in and figure out which end of the spectrum you believe and which end of the spectrum you want to walk towards. Who needs God? Perhaps everybody, perhaps nobody. But we can't just stay stuck in the middle and try to be neutral. You've got to walk one direction or another. Now, some of you are sitting there thinking, well, I find the tenets of atheism, a lot of them, to be very unsettling, but don't ask me to turn around and walk back towards God because I find my views of God to be extraordinarily unsettling. I get that. I get that. And if you're wondering, well, how do I figure out, how do I know if the God I walked away from was a bad version of God? How do I figure out what God is really like? You've got to come back next week. Next week, I'm going to do a message called The God of the No Testament. And I'm going to talk about some of these gods who we walk away from, some of these views of God we walk away from that are inaccurate, and it's a view of God, it's a type of God that's never existed to begin with. But remember, this week, you can't move away from something without moving towards something else. And maybe what you're moving away from is a version of God that doesn't exist anyway. If you come back next week, bring a friend with you. I'll help you figure out whether that's true or not. Hope you guys have a great week. We'll see you next Sunday. You're dismissed.